welcome back. I'm Izzy at Minerva. In today's video we're looking at how to create a shawl collar. This is a nice wide collar that has quite a dramatic effect, and you've probably seen quite a few patterns with this feature on it. So it's going to be great to see how we can do that in a lot more detail today. So go and grab your standard pattern drafting tools, which are listed next to me here. As always, you're going to be using your own bespoke bodice, so it will look different to the one that you're seeing on the screen above. Don't forget, if you've got any comments, please do pop them below the video. We always love to hear from our maker community here. All right, so let's get straight on into it. So on the pattern piece, we've got our center front line down here, and this is where the buttons are going to be going, and we want that to be the same location across both sides of the pattern piece. Grab your pattern drafting ruler and let's just draw a line 1.5 centimeters offset from the center front. So this line here creates the edge of the pattern piece, and the corresponding pattern piece, when it's flipped over, that edge will sit underneath, creating a nice 3 centimeter wide button stand in total. So what we now want to do is just draw in our neckline shape all the way down to our new line. This is just an approximate shape at this point. Now this isn't particularly a low cut neckline, it's going to sit reasonably flat as it is, so I'm not going to make the low neckline adjustment that we could do and that we've shown you on previous videos. So we're just going to use this as our neckline shape. Next we're going to grab our handy little button marking tool, which has an expanding gauge, and just mark on a couple of buttons along the centre front line. Ideally you want one button to be in line with the apex around the widest bit of your bust, so the top closes nice and neatly over that point there. Next we're going to start to look at the shoulders and to draw that collar in place. This is quite similar to video 60, which we did a couple of weeks ago, but there are some slightly different techniques because it's a wider collar, and we've also drawn our buttons differently to how we did on that video. Extend the shoulder line by the same length that it already is, so mine's 12.5. Next, mark a point that is 3 centimeters away from that extended line. The next thing we're trying to do is to continue the curve of the neckline all the way back to the centre back. Now go and grab your back bodice pattern piece, and if this was a normal design, our neckline would continue along like that, wouldn't it? But what we're trying to do is to create a collar that kind of goes continues all in one pattern piece. So what we want to do is to keep that point there, but we actually just want to flip the whole thing over. Next, we're going to keep that pivot point at that point, so pop your finger there and just rotate the shoulder line down until it hits your 3 centimeter mark. Next, mark the back neck point along the centre back, which is here. Draw a dashed line along the centre back from the neck point all the way along. Dot along where the neckline sits. And at this point you can just remove your back pattern piece. We're now going to draw in the roll line, which is where the collar kind of sits up and it breaks at the top of the collar effectively. So it's where the collar rolls from the inside to the outside, where that line will be on the garment. So along the extended shoulder line, mark a point that is 2 centimeters away from the neck point. And along the centre back, just mark a point that is 3 centimeters away from the neck point there. Next, just find a curve that you can join those 2 points together with. That roll line continues all the way down to this point down here, so just draw that in with a nice neat dash. We're now going to draw the width of the collar at the top at the centre back. Now this width, we want it to be the width of our shoulder, and that needs to come from the roll point all the way down. So the length of our collar needs to extend from the roll line all the way out that way. So taking the width of your shoulder at this point here, mark a point from the roll line along this centre back line, the same distance as your shoulder width. Then mark a point that is just 0.5 centimeter offset from there, and then draw in a line from the centre back to that new point. So here's a collar that I drew in earlier. This is effectively the kind of shape that I'm looking to draw. I might just soften off that curve at the bottom. My shoulder seam is up here, and effectively that shoulder seam will sit here at that point. So if I flip it over from the roll line, this is sort of the shape that I'm wanting. At this point you can use a carbon paper and your tracing wheel just to trace over that shape onto your piece of paper. So what we're working at really is a 12, for me, a 12 centimetre offset then all the way around the back as well. Draw in your style line of your collar. The next thing we want to do is to separate the back from the front because it's quite a wide collar, and what we want to do is to create a nice seam across the shoulders so that the collar can kind of be curved and sit nicely onto our shoulders rather than being super flat. Take your ruler and just extend the line of the shoulder line all the way out to your style line. Previously we marked a little point that was 3 centimetres away from that point there. Just continue that point to mark it along the style line. So for us that should be around 3 centimetres. Mark a point then halfway between those two along the style line. Draw a line from the neck point to that central line. This effectively becomes your shoulder seam now. Mark a point halfway along that line. Then mark a point 1 centimetre to either side of that point. Then use a pattern drafting ruler just to draw in a nice gentle curve from the neck point to the style line for both pieces. Now for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to cut out that back collar bit so that they're nice and clearly separate. Okay, so for this side we just removed that volume. For this side we've just cut out that pattern piece, and then we're going to cut around the curve as well. So now we've got a nice little curve there, nice little curve there, and all that does is just pinch the fabric together so that it sits really nicely on our shoulder. You'll see it at the big reveal at the end. Okay, let's draw in our facing line next. Our facings are usually about 5 centimetres offset from the neck point with this series. So mark a point 5 centimetres away from the neck point at the shoulder, and then just find a nice shape that hits the waistline perpendicular to the facing line that you're just drawing now. The only other thing to remember with our facing is that our facing pattern piece needs to just be a couple of millimetres smaller in width compared to the outer, so that the collar kind of curves under and sits under as we wear it. So all we're going to do along the style lines is we're just going to draw a line for our facing, which is about 3 millimetres smaller than the original line. Okay, let's trace over our pattern pieces now, adding our seam allowances as we need to. I'm going to talk you through how to do this step by step. We're going to start off with our back collar pattern piece. This is just going to be placed on the fold along the centre back line. Add a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance around the collar style line. And to the curved shoulder line, add your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance too. Add the seam allowance to the back neckline. Annotate your pattern piece as usual, just to say that this is the shawl collar, the back upper collar, and we're going to cut one on the fold. Draw a seam allowance to the side seam. We're not attaching the waist to anything, so you can just draw that straight in, adding your dart as necessary. Allow your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to the button stand. Now, as we draw our main front bodice pattern piece, our collar of the front pattern piece is actually going to be underneath the collar effectively, isn't it? It's going to become the under collar at that point, and the facing is then going to roll out on to the outside. So as we add our seam allowances for our main bodice pattern piece along the style line, we're just going to offset our seam allowance from the green dashed line, which is our facing line. Along the shoulder line, add your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance too, all the way along the collar and the full extent of the shoulder seam. There are no sleeves for us, so just draw in your arm side. Annotate the locations for your buttonholes and buttons. The grain line will follow the centre front as usual. And this is our shawl collar, our front bodice, and we're going to cut 2. Excellent. So now we've done our main bits, the bits that they're going to be seen. However, now we just need to do our facing for our front, so let's do that now. I'm just going to move my tracing paper down and draw in our facing pieces now. Follow the facing line that you drew in green. Now when you come to sew that, you may want to overlock it or add a seam allowance in so you can finish it nicely. For us, we're just checking the fit. Continue along the waistline, add your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to this button stand. And don't forget, with our facing, for our style line, the facing is actually rolled out onto the front, so this is the bit we're going to see. So we want the facing collar to be following our original style line, which is our red line on the screen. Allow a seam allowance for the full extent of the shoulder seam that you have for the facing pattern piece. Grain line follows the centre front, and this is our shawl collar pattern piece for the front bodice facing, and we're going to cut 2. Moving on to the back under collar pattern piece, let's draw our seam allowances now. The centre back line is going to be placed on the fold. Because this is the under collar pattern piece, we're going to offset our line around the style line from our green facing line, just so the collar sits nice and flat underneath the upper collar. Add your seam allowance to the shoulder seam of the collar. Annotate your pattern piece to say that it is to be placed on the fold and that it is the under collar. Brilliant. Brilliant. Let's move on now to trace over our back pattern piece, which is the same as usual. We've made minimal or no alterations to the back pattern piece. However, we do just need to add our facing in. Add your 5 centimetre facing line around the back of the neck, and then just draw that in. We'll draw in our facing to start off with. Add a seam allowance to the shoulder seam, and then add a seam allowance around the neckline. Draw in the bottom curve of the facing, follow the line of the centre back. Annotate your pattern piece. Place on fold. This is our back facing, and we're just going to cut 1 on the fold. Draw in the back bodice now. Follow the line of the centre back. Again, add your seam allowance to the neckline. Draw in your shoulder seam. Draw in the arm side. Add your seam allowance to the side seam. And then just draw in your waistline. Annotate your pattern piece. Place on fold. This is our back bodice. We're going to cut 1 on the fold. Now, as an extra precaution, you can also add your grain line to both the facing and to your main pattern piece. Sometimes people don't do that because they assume that if you're cutting it on the fold, it's obvious that it's going to be on the grain line. But for new beginner sewists, it's not always that obvious, is it? Brilliant. Okay, cut those pattern pieces out now and then out of calico. Excellent. Once you've cut out your tracing paper, we're then going to go and cut that out of calico, then come back and join me and we will sew it up together. Okay, so we've got our back and our front pattern pieces. We've got 2 darts on the back and 1 dart on the front. So to start off with, we are just going to pin and sew the darts together. If you're not sure how to do this, just refer back to video 22, where I talk you through all of the techniques in loads more details. Once you've sewn the darts to the front, just push them towards the side seam. And likewise with the back, we're just going to push those towards the side seam or towards the arm side at the top. Next, with right sides together, we're going to match up the shoulder seams of the front and the back. Pin both shoulder seams, and then we're just going to sew using a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Okay, let's now sew our facings together. Okay, so we've got the back facing, which is the bit that's going to sit from the neckline down, and this is the upper collar, which is going to be the bit that's facing on the outside. And effectively, with right sides together, we just want to pin along this curved edge. Grab a pair of scissors and just snip around the curve to take out the tension. So effectively, when the back collar is on, this is what you're going to see on the outside. Excellent. So taking our front bodice facing, we now basically just want to attach this seam to there and that seam to here. So with right sides together, flip the back collar and let's just pin that in place together. And likewise, we'll just do the same for the other side. Sew along those two seams using your standard seam allowance. Lovely, so when the collar's all done, it's going to look something like that, isn't it? Moving back now to our main bodice pattern piece, right side's facing up on the screen. So the collar bit here, when it's sewn together to the facing, will be sort of tucked under and the right side will be touching the right side of the fabric. So what we're going to do now is to sew our back facing our under collar to these two bits here. So I've got the collar piece and I'm just going to put right sides together along this curved edge here. And just for clarity, as I'm sewing, I actually want to mark the 1.5 centimetre kind of junction at this point here, so I know exactly where I want to be pivoting my collar pattern piece. Do the same for the other side as well, so you've got a nice little X marks the spot. So that X should line up beautifully with the side seam that you've got there. Just going to sew that one seam now in place before pinning the rest of it. Great, so that bit's done now. I'm then going to pivot the fabric across and we're now sewing the back pattern piece. So again, that X is just going to line up with the side seam here. Just pin all of that together now. And then we'll sew it in place. And then just pin the final bit of the shoulder seam collar. Just press those side seams now. Okay, next, with right sides together, we're going to lay our facing over the top of our piece. Now we're just going to pin that together all the way around. Don't forget that we are expecting to have to ease in the collar. It's because we want the facing bit of the collar to sit nice and smooth under the outer collar. Okay, so we've pinned it now all the way around. Let's just sew that in place. Brilliant. Now it's time just to turn that facing so it's on the inside and give it all a nice crisp press. The final thing we want to do is just to fold the front over the back and pin the side seams before we go and try it on. We're going to pin those at both, each side, and then sew using our standard seam allowance. Should we go and see what it looks like? Amazing! Okay, this is our shawl collar. It's very big and dramatic. It's been really fun to draft. Lots of different little techniques that we had to do just to create that fit and that nice volume across the collar. Don't forget that you can add this detail to any pattern piece. We've got a whole series about openings coming up in the next month, so you can apply this principle of this collar to a whole load of different openings and it's going to look amazing. So go away and have fun with that. It's a really nice dramatic feature to add to your pattern drafting skills. If you've had a go at this, please do upload your images and your photos onto social media and tag us here at Minerva. You can also create a free account on our website to upload your photos and to share what you've been creating and making with our maker community. Always love to see what you guys make there. So thank you for joining me today. I will see you next week for more pattern drafting skills.